Every generation leaves its mark upon the earth, and often that mark is a deeply peculiar one. Gardens, those living canvases, are particularly vulnerable to our whims. They are where our aspirations for beauty, status, and control over nature collide, sometimes with glorious results and sometimes with consequences that are, well, let's call them interesting. So, join us as we stroll through the forgotten paths of garden history, unearthing the 13 worst garden features that just had to go. The Grotto. Let us begin our journey not in the sun-draped rose garden, but in a deliberately dark, damp, and chilly hole in the ground. The Grotto was the pinnacle of the 18th century picturesque movement, a time when aristocrats decided that the ultimate status symbol wasn't a golden statue, but a meticulously constructed cave. The Grotto, simply put, was an artificial cave, often encrusted with shells, bits of colored glass, crystals, and tufa stone, all arranged to simulate a natural cavern one might find if trolls were real and had a thing for interior decorating. The goal was to evoke a sense of awe, which it did. It was a place where moss wasn't just welcomed, it was a design imperative. What we're talking about here is a home to ferns, the constant dripping of water, and even a population of startled frogs. The Grotto was the antithesis of comfort, but not to the wealthy anyway. Wealthy landowners would host entire dinner parties inside these chilly marvels, their guests huddled in furs, pretending to enjoy the novelty of eating roast pheasant in conditions befitting a caveman. Well, this romance of the dark and damp can only go on for so long. As the Enlightenment gave way to more sensible eras, the appeal of cultivating your own personal sickness-breeding cavern waned. The maintenance was also a nightmare. The constant moisture degraded everything, and the shell work required armies of artisans to repair. The Grotto faded because ultimately humanity collectively decided that a comfortable bench in the sunshine was a far superior place for contemplation than a dank hole that smelled of decay and required a change of clothes afterward. The Folly. Sprinkled across the estates of 18th and 19th century Europe, follies were buildings constructed with one primary purpose: to prove that the owner had so much money they could literally build a fake crumbling abbey or a miniature Egyptian pyramid just for the fun of it. A folly was an architectural non sequitur, a building with no practical function. They came in all styles: fake Gothic ruins, miniature Greek temples, sham castles, and even fabricated hermitages. The best part? They were often designed to look old and dilapidated from the moment the first stone was laid. Wealthy landowners were paying craftsmen to expertly construct incompetence. Some were built to enhance the view from the main house, creating a picturesque focal point. The age of extravagance eventually bumped up against the age of taxation and the occasional revolution. Displaying one's wealth in such a blatantly useless manner became, quite rightly, seen as tactless and financially reckless. While a few charming follies still dot the landscapes, the practice of building them died out as the aristocratic classes saw their fortunes diminish. The folly stands as a beautiful, ridiculous testament to a time when the answer to, "But what is it for?" was a carefree, "Why, for nothing at all, my dear fellow." As we turn our backs on the charmingly pointless folly, we now look downwards, to the earth itself, when our ancestors decided that the beauty of a lawn needed to be imprisoned behind glass. That brings us to the carpet bed. If nature is a gentle, flowing river, the Victorian carpet bed was an attempt to force it into a rigid reservoir. This was gardening not as an act of collaborating with Mother Nature, but as one of total domination. The goal was to make living plants behave like inanimate threads in a vast outdoor tapestry, often with terrifyingly showy results. Let's paint a better picture here, shall we? Imagine a vast flat bed, often in complex shapes like crests, scrolls, or even portraits. Now imagine it planted with hundreds of thousands of low-growing, brightly colored plants: alternanthera, echeveria, lobelia, and dusty miller, packed together so tightly they formed a solid, flat surface. The designs were often intricate, featuring words, clocks, and royal coats of arms. Maintaining a carpet bed required a small army of gardeners who were constantly trimming, replanting, and tweezing to maintain the perfect two-dimensional illusion. It was the ultimate display of control, a way for the newly affluent industrialists to show they could command both their factories and flora with equal iron will. Why did this have to go? Well, the labor, the sheer, back-breaking, unending labor. As the world moved into the 20th century, the staff required to maintain such features became prohibitively expensive and scarce. The aesthetic also fell spectacularly out of fashion, derided by the emerging arts and crafts movement as garish and unnatural. Modern gardeners, embracing the loose, romantic charm of perennial borders, looked upon photos of carpet bedding with a mix of horror and pity. It was a horticultural straitjacket, and we are all better off for having escaped it. As we recover from the visual assault of the carpet bed, it's time to face another. This time, though, an assault on our ears. The AstroTurf lawn substitute. Tired of mowing, watering, and battling brown patches? Well, our ancestors had a solution to that. A carpet of plastic grass, as green as a cartoon lime and just as natural. What do you know about artificial lawns? It was the ultimate suburban power move. While your neighbors were slaves to their lawnmowers, your yard was perpetually, perfectly, impeccably green. It was a low-maintenance, high-gloss dream, and for a shining moment, it seemed like the future had arrived. It was the freedom to spend your Saturdays on the golf course, not pushing a noisy mower. Freedom during water restrictions, when your lawn would remain the only green thing for miles, glowing with a smug plastic superiority. It was tidy. It was orderly. Well, it was also one big green lie. That would soon fade to history. First, there was the surface of the sun effect. On a warm, sunny day, your pristine plastic pasture would transform into a thermal weapon. The temperature could soar 20 to 30 degrees above the air temperature, creating a microclimate more suitable for frying an egg than for a picnic. The distinct aroma of melting plastic would waft through the air. Then there was the texture of regret. This wasn't the soft, lush grass of a meadow. This was the texture of a cheap, abrasive welcome mat. A slide on this surface was less a joyful childhood memory and more a lesson in friction burn, leaving you with what became known as AstroTurf rash, a red, scraped badge of synthetic courage. Ecologically, it was a dead zone. It offered nothing to bees, butterflies, or the soil food web beneath it. It was a plastic lid on the earth, preventing rainwater from soaking in and contributing to runoff. Any worm foolish enough to venture up would find itself in a plastic purgatory with no food and no way down. The lesson from the AstroTurf craze is simple. You can't fake life. A lawn should be a living, breathing, thriving ecosystem, not a decorative doormat for the planet. The Deathly Hedge Maze. Ah, the Hedge Maze, a once glorious garden feature designed for roaming royalty, daydreamers, and escape artists. It was basically like something off a grand fantasy novel. Found originally in the grand estates of Renaissance and post-Renaissance Europe, hedge mazes evolved from low-growing knot gardens into intricate labyrinths with towering walls of evergreen shrubs designed to puzzle and delight. But over time, some mazes turned into labyrinths of despair. Overgrown, thorny, and near impossible to navigate, these green prisons trapped more visitors than entertained them. Pruning became a nightmare, with gardeners wielding shears like swords, fighting back encroaching wilderness gone berserk. Not to mention the sneaky critters, snakes, spiders, and who knows what, lurking in the thickest patches. From a practical standpoint, their large space requirements and labor-intensive upkeep made them unsustainable as gardening trends shifted toward naturalistic and low-maintenance landscapes in the 19th and 20th centuries. The maze's downfall was its claustrophobic feel and maintenance weight. Who wants a hedge jail instead of a garden stroll, really? Many famous maze gardens were abandoned or tamed into simple hedgerows. Today, they still survive as whimsical or tourist attractions, but they are no longer practical features for most gardens. The miniature railway. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the age of the railway, and for whomever had everything, the logical next step was to build his own. Not for transport, mind you, but for pure whimsy. We're not talking about a simple loop of track for a model train. This was a large-scale, rideable railway that wound its way through the flower beds, over trestle bridges, and past the greenhouses. The owner, often dressed as a train conductor, would proudly chug along at a stately pace, giving his bemused guests a tour of his property from the unique vantage point of a tiny, smoking locomotive. The novelty for most was outweighed by the sheer impracticality. The tracks took up vast amounts of space, the engines required constant maintenance and coal, and the smoke and soot were unfriendly to delicate plants. It was an expensive, high-maintenance hobby that often interfered with the garden's primary purpose, being an actual garden. While a delightful eccentricity for a few, for most, it was a passing fad that ran out of steam. Pun intended. As the last whistle of the miniature railway fades, we encounter a feature that tried to capture the magic of the night sky, but often ended up looking like a pile of leftover rocks from a construction project. Colored mulch. There it was, the pinnacle of late 90s, early 2000s garden chic. You'd see it everywhere, from the manicured beds of a new subdivision to the tidy ring around a hospital sign. A time when the ground beneath our shrubs wasn't brown or black. Let us journey back to the era of colored mulch. So, how did this chromatic craze take root? Well, regular mulch made from shredded trees and bark was so inconsistent. It faded to a silvery gray. It was, frankly, a bit messy. Colored mulch, often made from recycled pallets and construction lumber, promised something revolutionary. Control. You could choose your aesthetic. Did you want the dramatic Gothic elegance of midnight black? The rustic brick path warmth of cedar red? The world was your oyster, and you were about to cover it in a uniformly dyed wood chip. It was tidy. It was long-lasting because the dye masks the natural fading process. It was the low-maintenance, high-impact choice for the busy homeowner who wanted their yard to look done. For a season, it was perfect. But like a bad dye job, the truth began to bleed through. First, there was the rain runoff. You'd get a heavy spring downpour, and suddenly your garden would look like it was sick. Little rivers of red or black would trickle onto your sidewalk, staining the concrete and leaving a telltale trail of your landscaping choice for all to see. But the most damning evidence was what we learned was in the dye itself. While many modern versions are proclaimed safe, the early iterations often contained questionable ingredients. Heavy metals like chromium, copper, and arsenic were sometimes used as colorants to make the color stick. Most mulches were considered fire hazards because of the additives and chemicals added to the wood. Gardeners began to ask a very reasonable question. Should I be sprinkling this next to my tomato plants and around the roots of my oak tree? The answer, increasingly, was a resounding no. The dreaded concrete lawn. Imagine the look on Mother Nature's face when she saw a lawn that was straight up covered in concrete. Yes, the infamous concrete lawn, a mid-20th century fad promising zero mowing, no watering, and eternal greenery. Sort of. It was more like a graveyard for earthworms and a death trap for any plant's dreams. Hard as a rock and twice as bland, this feature had no sweetness for the senses. The concept of a concrete lawn originated in the post-World War II era when suburban expansion exploded. Developers and homeowners alike craved an eternally verdant, low-effort yard that would stay pristine regardless of weather or neglect. This led to the widespread use of poured concrete over large sections of front yards or backyards, creating what was essentially a perpetually green surface. Think of it as an early precursor to the modern artificial turf obsession, only with a grittier and heavier feel. Well, its inevitable end came with a collective gardener's sigh and a roar of relief as people remembered what gardens ought to be. Alive. Concrete lawns, as it turns out, lacked the delightful crunch of leaves underfoot, the smell of fresh grass, and the joyful buzz of pollinators. The allure of zero mowing was eventually overshadowed by impracticality and environmental concern. As gardeners rediscovered soil and a sense of softness, another relic sneaked into the shadows. Oh, what could it be? Next up, the Orrery. The Enlightenment brought a thirst for scientific knowledge, and what better way to showcase your intellectual prowess than with a working model of the solar system stuffed right in the middle of your flower beds? The garden orrery was a grand stone and metal contraption designed to illustrate the motions of the planets around the sun. This was usually a large, permanent structure, often with metal rings, representing orbits and stone spheres for planets. While the intricate clockwork desktop orreries were beautiful, their garden-scale cousins were often clunky, immobile, and quickly rendered obsolete by new astronomical discoveries. They were a well-intentioned but ultimately clunky attempt to merge science with garden design, often creating a confusing focal point. Was one meant to admire and discuss your rose bush or ponder the positions of Jupiter and Saturn? Science also moved a lot faster than landscape architecture. An orrery built in 1750 would be embarrassingly inaccurate by 1780. Pluto's later discovery and subsequent reclassification would have given any garden orrery a serious identity crisis. They were also expensive and difficult to maintain. The wonder of the cosmos was better left to books, telescopes, and planetariums, not to a static, moss-covered ball of stone in your garden. The cockle shell path. Before the invention of affordable paving, gardeners used what was at hand. In coastal areas, this often meant shells, and that's where the cockle shell path comes into play. The cockle shell path sounds delightfully attractive and rustic, bringing the charm of the seaside to any garden. The reality, though, was a pathway of agony. Millions of cockle shells, with their sharp, ridged edges, were laid out in a bed to form a walking surface. While visually striking, especially when they gleamed in the rain, they were a torture device for anyone not wearing leather boots. They were unstable to walk on, with shredded bare feet and the hems of dresses, and the constant crunching sound underfoot could be quite distracting. Comfortable shoes became more common, but so did better, cheaper paving materials. Gravel, while still crunchy, is at least blunt. Asphalt and concrete offered smooth, silent, and reliable surfaces. The cockle shell path was relegated to history, a beautiful but brutal reminder that sometimes the old ways are best left in the past. The Sunken Garden. The early 20th century landscape design sought a new kind of order, one of geometry, intimacy, and surprise. The solution, seemingly, was to dig a very large, very elegant hole. Thus, the Sunken Garden was born, a feature that promised a walled paradise, but the reality was just a beautifully appointed drainage ditch. The concept was simple, really. By excavating a plot several feet below the surrounding lawn, a designer could achieve multiple lofty goals. First, it created a sheltered microclimate, protected from the desiccating winds that could plague flat, exposed estates. Second, it provided a natural sense of enclosure and privacy without the need for towering, expensive walls. The surrounding earth itself became the barrier. So, what went wrong? Why did these hidden Edens slowly fade from favor, leaving behind mostly waterlogged memories? Well, for starters, they were expensive to construct, requiring serious engineering to manage drainage, a problem that often proved their undoing, transforming them into stagnant mosquito-breeding ponds after a heavy rain. Their sheltered nature meant they could become windless, airless ovens in the summer. It was a feature that demanded perfection in its execution and then punished you for eternity if you got it even slightly wrong. Landscape fabric. There was a time when this material was hailed as a miracle. It promised a weed-free existence, a garden where you could just relax while your neighbors toiled, sweating and cursing the dandelions. It was the polypropylene promise of a better garden. Let us pay our respects to that roll of black woven ambition we once believed was the ultimate gardening hack, the impenetrable landscape fabric. The sales pitch was irresistible. Lay it down once and never weed again. It spoke to our deepest, laziest gardening desires. The logic seemed sound, a physical barrier between the blessed soil and the wicked world of weed seeds. the Great Wall of China for your chrysanthemums. So what went wrong with this genius creation? Well, for a season, maybe two, it seemed to work. The fabric held the line, and then the cracks in the armor began to show. You see, landscape fabric operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how gardens live. A garden isn't a static display, it's a bustling, dynamic ecosystem. The first sign of trouble was the mulch mosh pit. Wind, rain, and the simple passage of time deposit a thin layer of dust, dirt, and organic debris on top of the fabric. This thin layer of topsoil in exile becomes a perfect five-star hotel for the very weed seeds you were trying to block. Soon, you weren't weeding the soil, you were weeding the fabric, and these weeds, with their roots tangled in the woven fibers, became a special kind of hell to pull. You'd yank and the stem would snap, leaving the root to laugh at you from its synthetic stronghold. In no time, people soon realized that this polypropylene promise was nothing but a fad. So, let us bid a fond, and not at all sorry, farewell to the era of landscape fabric. The Aeolian wind harp. The Romantics dreamed of a garden that could sing, not with the chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves, but with an ethereal, haunting melody generated by the wind itself. The answer was the Aeolian harp, a simple box with strings placed in a breezy location meant to produce harmonious chords as the air passed over it. In theory, it was perfect. In reality, it was a shrieking nuisance. The best part of this garden feature was that you never had to command it to play. All you had to do was wait, hoping the wind would be both strong enough and in the right direction to create something other than a dissonant, mournful wail. Poets like Coleridge and Shelley wrote odes to its beauty, imagining it providing the soundtrack to their profound melancholy. For the average garden visitor, however, it was more likely to sound like a toddler fiddling with a violin. The Aeolian harp was a feature built on a fantasy. For every one moment of eerie, beautiful music, there were 100 hours of silence, or worse, screeching. It was an unreliable performer. As the Romantic era gave way to more practical times, the charm of an instrument that only worked when it felt like it and often sounded terrible quickly faded. The desire for garden music was eventually satisfied by the far more reliable and tuneful gramophone, and later the portable radio. The harp's ghostly notes fade into silence, leaving us in a garden that is, for a moment, peacefully quiet. But the human desire for spectacle is relentless. And what could be more spectacular than setting your own garden on fire? And so our tour of garden horrors comes to an end. It's a comforting thought, is it not? As we sit in our own gardens today, with their loose, billowing borders, comfortable chairs, and simple, bubbling bird baths, we can appreciate the journey. Our garden features today are less about what we can force the earth to do and more about what it can do for us. So, tell us, do you have any experience with any of these garden features? Please subscribe, and if you enjoyed this video, you'll love the next one.